The morning light hadn't even finished coming through the kitchen window when Grace Morgan's mother raised her glass and said the words she'd been saying for 20 years. "And this is my disappointment. The one who never made anything of herself." 60 guests laughed the way people laugh when they don't know what else to do. Grace stood there in her apron, holding a coffee pot, and let it wash over her the way she always did. She didn't know yet that in less than 10 minutes, the doors at the back of the Legion Hall would open, and a 72-year-old man in a gray suit would walk in and end this story for good. Not just the toast. 20 years of it. But to understand how she got to that room, you have to go back to the fall before, to the season Grace stopped trying to be seen by people who'd already decided not to look. Every first Sunday of the month, Grace made the 2-hour drive from her house in the city back to Cedar Falls, the way other people go to the dentist. You go because you're supposed to. You leave a little sore. Her alarm went off at 4:30 most mornings. By 6, she was standing on the floor of a distribution warehouse the size of 4 football fields, deciding which trucks rolled where, so that 139 farm supply stores opened with full shelves. That had been some version of her job for 16 years. Her family didn't know that. In their version, Grace worked at the farm store. Singular. A register. A name tag. Her mother, Margaret, liked that version. It fit the story she'd been telling since Grace turned 18. Grace pulled into the driveway of the house she grew up in, white siding, her father's old garage shut tight since the funeral 6 years back, and sat in the car a moment, watching the kitchen window glow. There were 2 versions of her. One ran a company. One drove home for dinner. Only one of them ever survived the table. Inside, her brother Daniel's voice carried through the walls, warm and loud, telling a story where he was the hero. Remember that sound. It matters later. Sunday dinner had assigned roles, same as a church play. Daniel, 41, sat in their father's old chair and performed, that night, a story about landing a big client for his insurance business, hands moving like he was conducting an orchestra. His wife, Rebecca, sat quiet beside him, cutting food for the twins. Their mother glowed at her son like he'd invented the sunrise. Then the light swung to Grace, just long enough to dim. "Still at the farm store?" Margaret said to no one who'd asked. "Some people find their shelf and stay on it." She patted Grace's hand when she said it. That was the thing about her mother. The cruelty always came dressed as affection. Halfway through dessert, a neighbor stopped by to return a dish, and Margaret walked her proudly into the dining room to show off the family. And there it came, smooth as a hymn sung 1,000 times before. "You know my son Daniel, the financial consultant. And this is my disappointment. The one who never made anything of herself." Grace said it was nice to see her, and meant it, because none of this was the neighbor's fault. She used to correct her mother. Used to bring facts to the table like receipts. It never worked. She'd stopped the year she turned 24, and there was a reason for that, one she'd get to. What she noticed driving home that night was that the neighbor never actually asked what Grace did. Nobody ever asked. The introduction always answered first. Monday morning, Grace badged into the distribution center while the sky was still the color of wet concrete. By 6:15, she'd rerouted 2 trucks around a closed bridge, approved an emergency generator for a store dealing with a power outage, and talked a warehouse lead out of quitting over a schedule dispute. 300 people reported up to her one way or another. Her title on paper was Vice President of Operations for a company that did nearly $400 million a year. A number nobody at her mother's table had ever heard. She'd started at 22 as a cashier, because it was the only job that called her back. Bookkeeper at 24. Store manager at 28. Regional at 31. Vice president at 35. Nobody handed her a single rung of that ladder. She'd counted her way up it. That morning, the company's founder, Richard Bennett, walked the warehouse floor the way he still did most Mondays, 72 years old, walking the aisles of his own life's work. He stopped by her clipboard, looked over the route sheet and said, "You're the quietest fix I ever hired." From Richard, that was the parade. That was the truth of Grace. The version with documents behind it. Her family didn't know any of it, and for a long time she thought that silence was entirely her own doing. It took her most of this story to learn that her silence had a business partner. Someone had been filling the space she left empty. And they hadn't filled it with nothing, they'd filled it with a version of her built to fail. Here's why she'd stopped bringing news home. The year she turned 24, she got her first salary job, bookkeeper, benefits, a desk of her own, and made the mistake of announcing it at Christmas dinner. Her mother set down her fork, looked around the table and said, "They gave her the calculator because she can't talk to customers." The table laughed. Daniel laughed hardest and added, "Better count fast before they count you out." Grace sat there and watched her good news get melted down and recast as a joke in under a minute. That was the education. Every fact she brought into that house came out the other side as ammunition. Her raise became they must be desperate. Her first apartment became throwing money away on rent. So she ran an experiment, the kind you run when you count things for a living. She stopped reporting. No promotions, no salary, no square footage. If her family's story about her was built from information she supplied, then starving the supply should freeze the story in place. For a few years it worked. And then slowly the story started moving again on its own. By the time she was 30, the family's version of Grace wasn't just modest anymore. It was struggling, barely hanging on. Lucky they still keep her. She hadn't fed that story a single new detail in 6 years, and somehow it had grown fatter, meaner, more specific. Someone else, it turned out, had been delivering news in her place. Their version of it. Every family has one safe person. Grace's was her cousin Lauren Reed, 2 years behind her in school, and 40 years ahead of everyone else in the family in the art of listening. They had a standing coffee date, first Saturday of the month, at a little brick cafe where the barista knew their order. Lauren got the real version of Grace's life, the only person who did. When Grace made regional, Lauren clinked her mug against hers. When Grace bought her house, a small craftsman with a porch swing, paid for in full, none of the family's business, Lauren toasted her with a cinnamon roll. When Margaret's introductions calcified into a permanent shape, Lauren was the one who said, "She's wrong about you. Someday everyone's going to know it." Grace held on to that sentence for years. She mistook it for love. She should have recognized it as skill. Looking back, there were tells. Lauren's questions always had an edge. A promotion like that, the money must be real now, huh? What did the house run you, if you don't mind me asking? At the time it sounded like a cheerleader wanting details. Cheerleaders do want details. So do scouts. Grace told her almost everything, and she drove home feeling lighter every single time. The first crack came over dinner in early December. Margaret was working through her usual catalog of Grace's shortcomings when she landed on something new. "I don't know why a person rents when she could save," she said sweetly. "Though I suppose when you overpay for a little house on the west side, there's nothing left to save." Grace kept her face still. But inside an alarm started ringing low and steady. She had never told her mother she'd bought a house. Never told her the neighborhood. Margaret had the location right and the price wrong, inflated, the kind of number you'd land on if a story passed through a couple of hands, each one rounding up. There were exactly 2 people on earth who knew what Grace paid for that house. Her closing attorney. And Lauren. At their next coffee, Grace asked her straight out. Lauren didn't flinch. That was the detail Grace would replay later. No flinch at all. She laughed easy as Sunday. "You probably said something after a couple glasses of wine. You know your mom fishes." It was plausible. That's the thing about good lies. They don't ask you to believe something wild. They hand you the boring explanation and let you carry it home yourself. Grace carried it. But she also started keeping track, quietly in her head, of what her family knew and when they knew it. Every leak has a source. You just have to map the water. A week later, Daniel stood up at dinner like the table was a podium. "I want everyone to know," he announced, "that I've finished consolidating all of Mom's accounts. Every statement, every bill, it all comes through me now. Somebody in this family has to take responsibility." His eyes landed on Grace when he said somebody, and let them sit there. Margaret squeezed his wrist with both hands. Thank God for my son. I'd have lost this house years ago without him. Grace did the math instead of saying anything, which is what she did instead of screaming. 6 years since their father died. 6 years of Daniel handling everything. A man whose insurance office had moved to a smaller strip mall twice in that same stretch. A man driving a new truck the same spring their mother started saying money was tight. None of it was proof. But bookkeepers notice when the outflow doesn't match the lifestyle. And Grace was noticing. She opened her mouth to say something. She never found out what, when her phone lit up with an emergency from one of her warehouses. She left the table mid-sentence, and behind her, pitched perfectly to reach her and still stay deniable, her mother said, "Some people just aren't built for family." Grace fixed the emergency from her car in a church parking lot. Nobody at that table ever knew. Her father, George Foster, had fixed farm equipment for 40 years. A quiet man married to a loud woman, and he'd survived it the way quiet people do, by having somewhere to go. His was the garage. When Grace made store manager, she never told the family. But one Saturday, she looked up from her register and saw her father standing near the fence post display in his work jacket. He didn't wave. He walked one slow lap around her store, looking at the shelves like a man inspecting a weld, and left. They never spoke about it. It was one of the best conversations of her life. The cancer took him fast 6 years back. Near the end in the hospital, he took her hand and said, "Take care of your mother, even when she makes it hard." Nearly his last words. She had kept that promise every year since, in a way nobody at that table had ever seen. What nobody knew yet, what was still sitting in a locked toolbox in a garage that hadn't been touched in 6 years, was that her father had known exactly what she was, and exactly what was coming. Spring came, and with it, her mother's 65th birthday plans. The Legion Hall 60 guests catered ham. To fund it, Margaret wanted the garage cleared out. Daniel got the toast. Rebecca got the decorations. Grace got the garage because it was dirty work nobody else wanted. She didn't argue. She wanted the garage. It was the last room of her father anywhere on earth. Under the workbench behind a stack of old parts she found his toolbox. The big steel one, rust-freckled, the one that was just his. Locked. No key anywhere in that garage. 6 years untouched. She loaded it into her trunk. As she closed the hatch, her phone rang. "Lauren. Hey, heard you're doing the garage. Find anything good in there?" Grace stood in the driveway with a feeling walking up her spine on small, cold feet. She'd been in that garage for hours. She hadn't told a soul. "Just rust," she said. It was the second time she'd ever lied to Lauren, and it already felt like practice. That night at her kitchen table, she cut the lock with a bolt cutter. Under the top tray of wrenches there were no more tools. There were newspaper clippings, dozens of them cut square, pressed flat, going back 16 years. A grand opening photo where you could just make out a new store manager in the crowd. A business page brief announcing regional leadership appointments, her name in the 11th paragraph. Her father had been keeping receipts on her life for 16 years, tracking a daughter who told him nothing through newsprint and distance and her mother's noise. At the bottom of the box was an envelope. "For Grace. When you're ready." His handwriting pressed hard into the paper. He wasn't good at saying things out loud in that house, he wrote. He figured she'd find the toolbox eventually, because she was the only one who'd bothered to clean the garage. "I know who you are," he'd written. "Being quiet about a good thing doesn't make it less good." And then, at the end in darker ink, like he'd come back to the page a second time. "One more job for you. Watch your mother's money. I don't trust where it's headed. You're the only one in this family who counts things." Grace sat in her kitchen a long time, the paper in both hands. 6 years. That warning had been sitting in the dark under a wrenched tray, waiting for her to be ready to hear it. Grief does something strange to memory. It files everything under loss and locks the drawer. Her father's letter picked that lock, and Grace spent the next week rereading 6 years of ordinary moments with new eyes. The month after the funeral, Daniel at the kitchen table with a folder of paperwork and a pen already uncapped. "Just some authorization so I can handle things for you." She'd thought it was kind. The next spring, Daniel's new truck in the driveway the same week her mother said money felt tight. The year after, Daniel and Rebecca in Florida for 10 days, a rented beach house with a pool, while Margaret took out a little something against the house for a roof that never got fixed. Grace drove past those same brittle shingles for 2 years straight. One of those things is a coincidence. 2 is a pattern. 3, with a power of attorney sitting quietly on file, is a business model. She had no statements yet. No numbers a lawyer could use. What she had was a dead man's handwriting telling her to watch. And 6 years of watching she'd already done without knowing it. Enough to act on. Not yet enough to win with. So she waited. In families like hers, the truth always surfaces at an event. While all this simmered, her actual life kept moving. And her actual life had Richard Bennett in it. In April, over lunch at the diner by his first store, he talked about turning 72, about his wife gone 9 years, about the son he'd lost young, mentioned the way you touch a stove you know is hot once quickly. Then he wiped his hands on a napkin and asked, "If this company were yours, what's the first thing you'd never change?" Notice the shape of that question. Not what would you change. The Monday walk, Grace said. The founder walking his own floor. The day leadership stops smelling the warehouse is the day the numbers start lying to them. Richard didn't say anything. He nodded once, slow, the way he nodded at a pallet stacked right, and changed the subject. Old men move like winter. Slow and then all at once. The following Sunday, Daniel stood in the emptied garage, hands on his hips, doing a slow appraiser's turn. What about the old man's toolbox? Anything worth money in there? Grace looked at her brother and saw the whole board for one clean second. He didn't know what was in it. Some instinct, the same one that had him seeding rumors, made him want inventory on anything he didn't control. Just rusty wrenches, she said. Kept it for sentiment. It was the first deliberate lie she ever told him. Felt like putting on safety glasses. Not dramatic. Just correct given the work ahead. 2 days later, Richard's assistant called. He wanted an hour, no agenda. Grace said of course and stood at her kitchen window a while after, letting herself finally name the feeling. That Saturday over coffee Lauren went fishing. Well, 7 layers of casual. Weird thing. Somebody told my mom that Hartwell's founder is stepping down. Picking a successor. That's your company, right? You hear anything? Every alarm Grace owned went off at once, quietly, like warehouse lights coming on row by row. There had been no announcement. No press. The only people on earth who knew Richard's intentions were Richard, his attorney, and as of 4 days earlier her. Information wasn't leaking out of her company. It was leaking out of her. First I've heard of it, she said. They don't consult the shelf stockers. Lauren studied her a half-second too long. So Grace ran the test she wasn't proud of, and would run again anyway. She dropped her voice into the register she'd used with Lauren for 12 years. Honestly, don't repeat this. I might be transferred. Out of state. I haven't told Mom. Lauren squeezed her hand. Said the right thing. Always said the right thing. Grace sat in her car after and set a timer in her head. Die in the pipe. Now we watch the water. It took 8 days. At Sunday dinner, her mother put down the gravy boat. I hear you're being shipped off. Even your company wants you somewhere else. 9 days. One word spoken once to one person over coffee. And here it was, coming out of her mother's mouth with gravy steam rising through it. The pipeline had a name and the name was Lauren. The Tuesday before, Richard's office looked the same as it had for 40 years. Oak desk, a window over the loading dock. His attorney was there. And on the desk sat a document as thick as a hymnal. 16 years I've watched you count what matters, Richard said. The freight, the people, the days. Never once yourself. He turned the document around. Succession agreement. President and Chief Executive Officer. Now count this company as yours. Grace read it twice because reading things twice was who she was. Why not a search firm? A bigger name. Fine talkers, Richard said. I need an operator. The quietest fix I ever hired. Signing 2.5 weeks out. Press release the Monday after. And one condition. Before Monday, I meet your family. I don't hand my life's work to a ghost. My mother's 65th is that Saturday, Grace told him. Good. Then Saturday. 3 days. 3 dominoes standing in a row her family couldn't see. Fate had other timing. The Tuesday before the party, going through the family lockbox for her mother's birth certificate, Grace found a stack of papers that stopped her breath. A home equity line of credit against the paid-off house. Balance: $118,000. A past due notice red-bordered. Beneath that, retirement account withdrawal summaries, 1 a year 6 years running. Each one a bucket lowered into her mother's savings and hauled up empty. That's Daniel's paperwork, Margaret said, barely looking over. It's how the money works now. He has a license. Grace read every page without touching anything but the edges. Real signatures. Her mother's own hand trusting on every line. No forgery. Nothing for a prosecutor to bite on cleanly. Just a widow signing what her rock put in front of her. The sum, done in her head by the coat hooks. Around $210,000 gone, plus a mortgage reborn on a house that had been paid off. And the only thing that had kept the county from taking that house already was 6 years of property tax, paid quietly by the daughter everyone called a disappointment. She gave her brother one door. She drove to his office and laid it out flat like a freight manifest. Return what you can. Close the line of credit. Hand back the power of attorney. Do that, and this stays a family matter. Daniel put his boots up on the desk and smiled. Prove it. Those are Mom's signatures. Her money, her choices. Who's going to take your word over mine? You're the family screw-up, remember? He walked her to the door. Careful. Mom only has one story about you. Don't make me add a chapter. He wasn't reckless. He was rational, inside a world where the only witness against him had spent 20 years being told she was nobody. His whole fortress had one load-bearing wall, and that wall had about 48 hours left standing. Friday morning, an elder law attorney confirmed what Grace feared. Voluntary signatures, a PO freely given, no forged documents. Criminal charges would be an ugly road with a trusting widow as the star witness against her own son. But there was a civil path. Revoke the POA. Freeze the accounts. A forensic accountant to map every dollar, then negotiate it back with teeth. Every step legal. Every step fatal to Daniel's kingdom. It required one thing Grace didn't have: her mother's consent. The real battlefield wasn't a courtroom. It was a 65-year-old woman choosing between her rock and her records, in front of the whole story she'd built about both her children. That afternoon Richard called himself. Tomorrow. Your family. Anything I should know. Grace told him everything. All of it, 20 years of it, the brother, the toolbox, the letter, the $118,000. Offered to let him postpone. The line went quiet. Then, my father told me I'd fail at everything but drinking. I built the first store to spite him. A pause. Saturday, I won't just meet your family. I'll meet my company's first test. At 5 o'clock they signed. Pages turning, a chair creaking. A fountain pen writing her name into the spine of a 45-year-old company. When the ink dried, Richard shook her hand. Congratulations, Madam President. Then with mischief that took 40 years off his face. See you tomorrow. Had my girl call your mother's RSVP line. Told them a friend of yours from work might stop by. Meanwhile, Daniel hadn't been idle. Thursday night, he'd called a dinner of his own and told the family, heavy and reluctant, that Grace had been let go. The transfer fell through, they just cut her loose. By Friday morning, her unemployment was church-wide fact, garnished with prayer. Grace waited that night with a signed succession agreement in her bag. Speak now, and it's her word against a 20-year archive, with Daniel holding 48 hours to spin it muddy. Stay silent, and she walks into the party tomorrow as the jobless disappointment one more time. She chose the apron. Let him spend his last 2 days building her humiliation taller. Every inch he added was altitude for the fall. Saturday, the Legion Hall filled with 60 guests under a banner reading Margaret, 65 years young. Grace set tables in her good apron. Lauren arrived early, eyes jumpy. I heard about the job. I'm so sorry. You seem so calm. She was searching for a word that came out almost like an accusation. Systems fail loud when their data goes bad. Balanced books make for steady hands. Dinner. Daniel's toast, 10 flawless minutes about sacrifice and a mother's love. Then Margaret rose, glass high, thanked the room, thanked her son, my rock. And finally found Grace by the kitchen doors. Come up here, honey. Don't hide. 60 faces turned. Grace walked to the front because you don't brawl at a birthday. Her mother slid an arm around her waist, smiled her hostess smile, and said the sentence she'd polished for 20 years. And this is my disappointment. The one who never made anything of herself. The laughter came, scattered and obedient. And over it, Grace heard car doors in the parking lot. Lauren caught her by the hallway, 2 glasses of wine deep, and it poured out of her. The coffees, the Sunday night calls, the questions with assignments attached. Your mom knows about your promotions, Grace. The big one years ago. I told her myself years back. I thought it would make her proud. She just went quiet. Then she said, if that's true, then what does that make me? And she kept introducing you the same way anyway. She needed the story. 7 years. Her mother had known for 7 years and chosen the introduction over the truth every single time. Thank you for finally telling me, Grace said level. You're 12 years late. She walked back into the hall as the double doors opened. Richard Bennett entered in his gray suit, unhurried. The room's noise died in rings, table by table. Farm families knew that face from the sign on the highway their fathers had shopped under for 3 generations. Daniel, still holding the toast microphone, strode over with his hand out. Full salesman wattage. Welcome, sir. Grant. Daniel Evans, financial consultant. Friend of the church. Richard took his hand for exactly 1 second. No. Then he crossed the whole silent hall to Grace, took the coffee pot out of her hand, set it down and turned to face 60 witnesses. Forgive an old man for crashing a birthday. 45 years ago, I built a company out of 1 feed store. Some of your fathers shopped there. Nods all over the room. Monday, the papers will tell the whole state who's taking it from here. But I'm old-fashioned. Family should hear it first. He looked at Margaret when he said family, then tightened his hand on Grace's shoulder. Meet her now. Grace Morgan. 16 years with my company, cashier to running every store I have. My successor. The next president and CEO of Hartwell Farm and Ranch Supply. The finest operator I've met in half a century. A beat of pure vacuum. Then the hall detonated. Gasps, chairs scraping, applause rolling forward from the farm tables first. The people who understood exactly what those words weighed. One of the twins stood on her chair, screaming her aunt's name, and nobody tried very hard to stop her. Margaret turned slow, glass tilting, wine sliding over her knuckles. For the first time in 20 years, she had no introduction ready. Richard leaned in. Your father bought his first wrench from my first store. Then he handed her the microphone. Thank you, Richard, Grace said, voice level the way it went level in a crisis. Mom. Happy 65th. For 20 years you've introduced me as your disappointment. I stopped correcting you a long time ago because I learned something in this family. The truth doesn't need an introduction. It just needs time. She let the quiet sit. Then to her brother. Monday at 9 the press release goes out. Right after, a records request goes to the bank. You know which records. Daniel came up out of his chair, laughing too loud. This is a stunt. Ask anyone, she's the family screw-up. And heard the sentence collapse in his own mouth, in front of the man whose sign hung over half the farms his clients worked. What broke him wasn't Grace. It was Rebecca, standing at her table, still holding their daughter's hand. Tell them about the line of credit, Daniel. The $118,000 against your mother's house. Tell them about our kids' college fund. I found the statements in March. I kept waiting for it to be a mistake. Daniel grabbed his coat off the broken chair and walked out through the doors Richard had come in by. The June evening swallowed him. Margaret hadn't moved. Grace walked to her and set an envelope on the table beside the cake. Property tax receipts. 6 years paid from my account every installment since Dad died. You never lost this house, Mom. Your disappointment kept the roof on it. Inside, alongside the receipts, a photocopy of a letter in a mechanic's handwriting. Dad knew. Now you do. Her mother caught her in the parking lot. You did this at my birthday. My night. And then, for the first time in 38 years, her voice cracked in the middle. If I said you were nothing, then staying behind didn't make me nothing. For one breath, she was just a person. I'll pay for the forensic accountant, Grace said. And the attorney. They'll call Monday. The house can still be saved. That part's your choice. She opened her car door. But the introductions are over, Mom. You will never introduce me again. From now on, I introduce myself. She drove home with the windows down, and for once the drive got lighter to carry the whole way. Monday at 9, the press release went out. Her mother took the help. Fear of losing the house outran fear of losing the story. The power of attorney was revoked, the accounts frozen, the line of credit closed. A forensic accountant mapped 6 years of damage in 14 pages, and facing a civil suit and a room full of witnesses, Daniel signed a restitution agreement that would follow him for years. He sold the truck by August. Rebecca filed for separation and rented a place near the kids' school. The first personal thing Grace did as president was open 2 college accounts, funded and untouchable, in the twins' names only. Their father's ledger wouldn't be theirs to inherit. Lauren wrote a 4-page letter. Grace read it twice and answered with one line. Start telling the truth for free. It suits you. 3 months later, on an ordinary Tuesday, her mother called. No introduction. No audience. Just, the furnace man came. Thank you. For minutes about the weather and the twins. Not an apology, Grace had stopped billing for those. But for the first time in her adult life, a conversation between 2 people, neither of them a disappointment. Good night, Grace, her mother said. And her own name sounded almost new. 20 years of being introduced wrong taught her one thing, and it fits in a single sentence. The only introduction that ever mattered was the quiet one she gave herself every morning at 4:30. Show up, count what's true, and let time read it out loud.